So let me kick off. Thank you again, everyone who has joined. Again, this is a session around one of the newer terms in the security space, and that is CNAPP, standing for the Cloud Native Application Protection Platform, and why adopting a single source of truth helps organizations to secure their deployments and applications. Thank you again, everyone who joined. I'm looking forward to spending the next 30 to 45 minutes with you, and let's get going. A little bit about myself, and that's the topic everyone likes the most talking about. But yes, my name is Markus Strauss. I'm the head of product management at Runecast, and first of all, again, welcoming you here, joining me at this webinar. Apart from spending obviously a lot of my time around security and monitoring, I am an avid motorcyclist, although with the Irish weather that is not always as easy to achieve. But yeah, as you can see, I've spent quite a bit of time before joining Runecast in various different security organizations in various different roles. And now I'm with Runecast since early this year. So again, thank you very much for joining. A little bit about the agenda. So we've just done the intro, right? So we've got that out of the way. That's great. I will try to limit the amount of slides to relatively small set, because most of these are going to be conversations and things that I will be speaking about. And really, I don't want to have death by PowerPoint, right? But what we will be doing is we will have a look at how distributed architectures lead to, well, equally distributed problems. And this is one of the key areas that we cannot forget when we start thinking of cloud migration, cloud first approaches, cloud native applications. The second is what actually is CNAPP, right? So what can we think of when we think of cloud native application protection platforms? And then lastly, how CNAPP can help you, right? How CNAPP can help organizations to really improve their security posture, to really improve their efficiency and reduce overhead. Right? So let's start off with distributed architectures. And the terms distributed architectures have been around for quite a while, right? And it's used in many different connotations across the industry. Often, we're talking highly distributed architectures in a sense of containerized workloads, ephemeral workloads, things that don't live very long. But equally, this also applies to our overall general infrastructure, right? And what I mean by that is probably going to get more obvious in this slide, because quite frankly, when we think of cloud migration, cloud deployments, hybrid, multi-cloud, in a lot of ways, we do fall victim to the assumption that one replaces the other. And I'm pretty sure everyone in the audience here will agree that that is usually not the case, right? This is usually an additive process, meaning as we're migrating and as we're adding different workloads, we're adding to our tech stack instead of replacing. And I always use the example of mainframe. Everyone in the audience who's been around for a while will remember mainframe, and everyone thought mainframe is dead a long time ago, yet IBM still produces even net new mainframe, and mainframe is still very much alive and very much in use. And we see the same when we look at the cloud migration, when we look at cloud deployments. Very often, these cloud native deployments do not replace one-for-one existing deployments. This becomes an additive conversation, right? So but that also translates into, unfortunately, being a very complex scenario, right? So when we think of complexity, then the next one is going to be an interesting one, right? And I'm just going to kind of let this build bit by bit, right? So let's assume we are deploying in a true kind of multi-cloud fashion, right? So we've got our AWS instance on one side, well, our AWS deployment on one side, and we've got, one of our geo regions that's served by this deployment. Now let's add maybe a GCP deployment to that, right? Which serves another geo. And on top of that, we might have some hybrid or on-prem setup, public-private cloud or similar, right? This is kind of a very, I wouldn't say standard, but a fairly common type setup. Obviously, each one of these are interchangeable, right? I mean, we may end up with various different AWS regions rather than, a split between two geos between AWS and GCP. We might also throw Azure into the mix here. Any permutation of this is fairly standard and fairly commonly found these days. Now, one of the problems this creates is if I start adding things like security standards and compliance standards into the mix, I now have potentially two geolocations with different legal requirements as it pertains to compliance standards or security standards. And equally, I might have two regions that serve different technologies which require different tool sets. And if I start bringing the technologies into the place, you'll start getting a picture of the, excuse me, the complexity of a deployment like this, how easy this becomes very complex, right? And this is one of the bigger challenges that we face in the industry at the moment and over the last number of years, is the fact that, going back to the conversation that I started earlier on, all of this is additive, right? While historically we would have looked at maybe on-prem and maybe a hybrid cloud deployment of sorts, now over the last number of years, we've also added true multi-cloud deployments, varying geographical regions with varying different requirements, an ever increasing amount of different technologies that we can and likely should be using, right? I mean, there's a lot of innovation that happens when we start using new technology, but it always comes with an added cost of complexity and an added cost of supportability, risk, all of the things that are attached to that. And instead of replacing the incumbent technology with the new technology, we generally end up adding it, right? So this is this additive approach of technology just stacking up as we progress. Now, what that means for us in terms of dealing with security, dealing with compliance, dealing with vulnerability assessment, all of these things usually translates into a very chaotic and oftentimes expensive and inefficient way of vendor selection, tool selection, product selection. And if you want to try to visualize this, this might start looking familiar to some of you in the audience, but this is what a traditional approach looks like, right? And many companies I've either worked for or I've been speaking to over the years, this kind of scenario and setup has pretty much been commonplace, right? Vendor consolidation is not a new concept. This has been around in the industry for a long time, but this kind of signifies and visualizes a little bit the pitfalls of the rapid growth in technology and the rapid growth in opportunity to deploy cross-cloud, to deploy hybrid, because when we look at having to tackle security and compliance challenges across not just one type of deployment, but across multiple different types of deployments, multiple different types of tech stacks, we start running into problems of not every vendor is going to be able to support everything that we need, right? So inevitably, we are left with having to stack vendors. And what that means is we end up with 3, 4, 5, 7, and oftentimes more vendors with multiple different solutions trying to do a certain set of requirements that we have as organization across all of the different types of deployment and across all of the different types of technologies. And you can see that here in this admittedly somewhat chaotic graph, but it's a very good representation of what you would realistically look at in any sort of mid-sized to larger sized organization where you have multiple different types of deployments and you end up with many different vendor combination and vendor permutations and solutions, right? And obviously one of the downsides of this, quite obviously, is the fact that in a lot of cases, these different solutions, even if they're from the same vendor, may not talk to each other, right? They may not share information. There might not be any correlation with data points. And that gets even worse, obviously, if they're from different vendors. Of course, there is a large push within the industry for integrations, for APIs, and this is fantastic from a technology perspective. However, realistically, from a everyday, day-to-day work perspective, it's a lot of work to build these integrations, right? I mean, yes, some vendors provide integrations, some vendors provide help in integrating, others don't, and there's varying degrees of support integrating different solutions with each other. But bottom line is it yet adds another layer of time that needs to be spent, and therefore money that needs to be spent to get these different solutions talking to each other and really trying to provide a holistic view on what we're seeing here on the screen. So when we look at this and then we start looking at CNAPP, right? So when we think about CNAPP, what is a cloud native application protection platform? And the common misconception starts already with the fact that it has to be cloud native. No, what it means is that the platform itself is designed to protect cloud native applications, right? But equally, it has to extend to the rest of the infrastructure as well. And as so often, when we think about new concepts or bringing new concepts to market, or when we start seeing trends, we tend to do the same thing as we talked about earlier on with the tech stack. We tend to forget about the existing, right? So it's really important to think of CNAPP as a holistic way of looking at the environment with the cloud focus, with the cloud native focus, because that's where the biggest risks are. But from a customer perspective, from an organizational perspective, I have to ensure that I can protect my workloads, irrespective of where they are in the stage of the cloud migration. And some of these might not migrate at all, right? So we do need to think of this as a holistic approach to the protection, right? But as it says in the name already, it's about a platform. And often there's various different terms that we can use. Some of these are more marketing terms than others, like single pane of glass, all of these, we've heard them for many years, but it is considered, or we should consider, the CNAPP platform as a single source of truth. And the reason why this is so important is because of the problems that I kind of touched on earlier on, in the sense of when we don't have the ability within an organization, within a deployment, to have all of the different vendors and all of the different solutions connected to each other, and the ability to correlate that data, then it becomes incredibly difficult and incredibly complicated, and very error prone, to be honest, to have really good processes and really good ways to detect vulnerabilities across the entire stack, detect configuration drifts, for example, across the entire stack. And it becomes a siloed approach, right? And this is something from a security perspective and from a compliance perspective, we obviously ought to focus on reducing. We have to make sure that we look at our security posture holistically in its entirety, right? And not just based on technology. And this is something that we've seen in the market for a while. And it's quite natural, right? New technologies generally invite the innovation of new vendors. Um, Container security is a very, very good example of this. The area of container security is rapidly changing and growing. There's many new vendors that have entered the market and are very focused on this area, which is fantastic because it means it creates and fosters innovation. However, it does not help with the problem at hand, right? Because again, it means yet another tool set. And to continue with the additive analogy, we're just adding more into the mix without the ability to really look at this more holistically, more from a overall perspective. So when we think of CNAPP and when we think of a cloud native application protection platform, we really need to think of it as a holistic view across our security posture, across our entire deployment stack, right? So that includes on-prem, that includes hybrid cloud deployments, that includes multi-cloud deployments. And really, when we look at the right side of this screen, the areas that we need to focus on from a security and compliance perspective and from a development perspective, right? Because we've also added new teams into the mix that have now responsibility over certain amounts of technology, right? So I'm talking DevOps, SRE, DevSecOps, depending, on the organization, it might be called slightly different, right? But again, it's all about this holistic approach of having security from the inception, meaning at the code stage, all the way through the deployment and through the runtime when the finished product, if you will, is running. So all of the things that we need to be worried about as an organization are our data security, right? So knowing what's where, knowing who has access to it, and we're getting into the entitlement management and things like that. We need to be able to have proper compliance controls. We need to be able to manage compliance across all of our different workloads, across all of our different deployments. We got to be able to do vulnerability assessment, again, across the entire spectrum, and not just one vendor for one, another vendor for another type of technology, because again, it's vitally important to have one set of policies, one set of rules that applies to all, right? That is, at the heart of having a mature security and compliance setup is having the ability to have the same rules apply to anything, right? And everything. Container security is becoming a much bigger topic. Mentioned that earlier on, by and large because of its benefits, right? It's incredibly easy to rapidly deploy and scale, unlike anything other than maybe serverless or function-based deployments. But generally, container-based deployments are incredibly fast, incredibly agile, very easy to scale up and down autonomously, right? That's a big topic. So container security is a big aspect, especially because containers are different, right? Traditionally in the general security space, we have a vulnerability, we identify the vulnerability, we have a look that we have a patch, we patch it, vulnerability is gone. Container is slightly different because we don't patch, right? Because containers are effectively a closed off image. So we need to redeploy, we need to have a new image that has the right version or the right fix. So this brings different challenges. Configuration drift. I've touched on this very early on. Configuration is one of the key elements of ensuring that everything that needs to be the same is the same, right? It's very easy over longer period of times to miss subtle small changes in configuration. Now, granted, some of these are going to be absolutely perfectly normal, but others might not. And the problematic aspect are the ones obviously that might not, right? And having the ability to do that across, again, the entire deployment, so not just on-prem or not just in one cloud or another, is one of the key elements that CNAPP provides. We touch on entitlement management, and then we've got threat detection and API security, right? So threat detection is your typical, malware scanning, things like that. And then API security really goes down to API development, API calls, things of that nature. But again, when you think about the slide before, the chaos of all of the different vendors, all of the different solutions for potentially different deployment options, it's logical and it makes logical sense to, as an industry, to start thinking about how can we get all of this together? Because quite frankly, as vendors, we have worked on this for a long time, right? Usually it was one vendor or vendors individually who would try to create ways to plug in different technologies into one offering. But the difference here is oftentimes that was multiple different products that, albeit potentially did work together, but there were still different entities, right? Different products, potentially through acquisitions and things like that. It was more a packaging exercise than actually having a solid, combined, unified product or offering, right? And CNAPP as a category really is aimed and designed to bring vendors to the table and create a unified platform for customers, right? That will allow customers to cover all of these areas that we talked about in one platform, not a combination or plug in from various different sources, but a true combined platform. So what are the benefits that organizations get by implementing CNAPP, right? And I guess for pretty much everyone on the call, we've all seen all of the different technologies and all of the different solutions that we can use to address each one of the different areas that we've just talked about. And we're likely all going to be very familiar with the vendors that we use and what's the reason, right? There's multiple reasons for that, and I'm only going to touch on three. I think there's many more, but the three main ones that we can touch on is one, it's the reduction of tool sprawl, right? So everyone probably knows the images that are on the screen, and this is only a small portion of what's in existence in the industry, but really tool sprawl has been a problem for a long time. And this problem is touching many different areas, right? So for example, because of the fact that we do have and still have a skills shortage, and now so probably more than ever before, needing to learn and work with many different solutions or tools is very time consuming, right? It requires a lot of time for the individual, and it requires a certain amount of expertise that is sometimes really hard to come by. And on top of that, it's just time consuming, right? It's not easy to respond to something, some form of threat that may be moving through our environments if we have to use multiple different tool sets, right? It's really difficult to track something or a potential risk, not necessarily just talking about a active actor, right? I'm talking about just tracking a potential risk of exposure, whether that's something that, something is misconfigured or, something else. But it's incredibly difficult to track this risk across multiple different deployments using multiple potentially very different solutions, right? Because you're not looking at the same data, you're not looking at the same representation of the data, and you got to go back and forth, figure out what's what, how are things connected to make sure you are looking at the same potential exposure rather than just two very different things, right? It also just means that the more I have to use, the higher the risk that I'm going to miss something, right? Again, you know, because most of these do not fully integrate. Yes, most vendors integrate with each other, or at least in some form, but we're still not talking full integration, right? And in a lot of cases, for the after the fact, we're using, SIEM solutions and things like that, or SOAR to orchestrate steps. But again, going back to having to do the main part of our work, which is going back to basics and understanding what's the risk in my environment, what's the type of vulnerability that I have, what's the type of risk of exposure that I have. That's the sort of thing that we have to do across all of the environments, and we have to do that consistently. And consistency is one of the major problems that we have when we have to employ multiple different solutions, because our output is not going to be consistent. Potentially the efficacy between vendors is not going to be consistent, meaning we might get more false positives or false negatives on one side than on the other. So all of these things play a massive role. And then on top of that, is as if that wasn't already challenging enough, you add the cost implication to that, right? I mean, if you look at, and this is not from us, this is from an IBM survey, the average enterprise uses 45 different security tools, right? I mean, that's a pretty big number. Now, that changes a little bit with the size of the organization, but again, even if we would be very, very modest, we can still easily hit 20, no problem. And there's a cost implication to that as well, right? Not just the man-hour cost in terms of the training and the learning, and the loss in efficiency of having to go through many different tools, but equally from a purchasing perspective, right? I mean, it's not cheap, right? When you have to deal with, even if we say there are 20 different solutions, and let's say we have already been pretty good and we've got 2 solutions per vendor, that still means we're going to have to deal with 10 vendors, right? And that means from a purchasing perspective, it is going to be more expensive than if we can consolidate, right? So that's definitely one of the areas that is a huge benefit of looking at it from a holistic platform approach rather than from an individual vendor approach. The next one is automation, right? Automation is one of those concepts that's been, we talk about this for a very, very long time. And in a lot of cases, that is, when we think of automation, we start thinking about what will we do after the fact, right? So I've mentioned SIEM and SOAR earlier on, security orchestration. There used to be a time, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, where this was really, really big topic, and it still is, right? It's still a big topic. We still got to be able to do something with the discovered whatever, right? With the things that we find. But equally, the finding part itself needs to be part of that conversation, right? So when you look at the vulnerability cycle here, or the security cycle here, really what we're looking at is, we have to be able to discover, assess, report, remediate, and verify, all in an automated fashion. And again, we need to kind of elevate the way we think about this away from single deployment to entire estate, right? And by that, I mean, we have to be able to do this as efficiently and with as high of an efficacy as we can across all of our deployments. And again, this is where CNAPP comes in and tries to create this single platform where we can really automate the entire process through one single platform across all of the different deployments, right? So we don't have to deal with different scan times, different anything really, right? Because it's a continuous automated process. And the word continuous there is really important as well, because again, it means we have the ability to do these continuously across our entire deployment, right? So again, in some areas, traditionally, when we used one vendor for one area, we might be able to do something like, I don't know, we scan once a week and we're okay with that. Now we've got more ephemeral type workloads where they might not live a week, right? Our life and destroy or create and destroy cycles have gotten much shorter when it comes to creating workloads. So a weekly scan is not really sufficient because it means we may have had workloads that have already spun up and spun down again and have disappeared, and we've had a black spot that we could not control from a vulnerability perspective, from a compliance perspective. So we have to have the ability to do this in an automated fashion. Depending on the workload, we need to be able to prioritize how we deal with these, depending on the potential risk exposure, all across all of our different deployments, right? So from on-prem through hybrid, through multi-cloud, to ensure that no matter where our workload lives, where the application resides, we can have the same controls and the same policies and the same automation in place to allow for the same risk management, right? So the same way of looking at potential exposure risk, the same way of looking at potential remediation and things like that. Lastly, compatibility, right? I kept going on and touching on the fact that we have to be able to do these things across multiple different places, right? And at the heart of this is compatibility, right? As an industry, one of our biggest challenges when we think of how we can protect multiple different deployments is not necessarily the technology of the deployment, it's the lack of support to monitor these technologies from our favorite vendor, right? But I mean, the incumbent vendor that we have for doing the same task in our environment that we did before, we would obviously like to use now for a new type of environment one. So think of, for example, vulnerability assessment, right? We might have a very good solution in place that has served us really well on-prem, and maybe even in a private cloud deployment or similar, right? But now we're starting to extend, right? We're adding AWS, we're adding GCP, public cloud, we're adding some containerized workloads, and now we start running into the problem that vendor one might only cover what we had traditionally, Windows server-based, Linux server-based environments, maybe VMware, and maybe a little bit in AWS, and the rest is no longer covered, right? So that's when we start adding another vendor and another vendor and another vendor. Compatibility is really, really important, right? Part of the entire concept of the Cloud Native Application Protection Platform is the fact that there have to be compatible with what we use on-prem, with all of the hyperscalers, with all of the containerized workloads, with all of our general workloads, speak endpoints, Windows, Linux, right? Have to have the ability to look at cloud native workloads, right? So we're talking S3 buckets and things like that. And this all, again, the word platform is in CNAPP. It all comes back to one centralized platform, one centralized place where we can then manage our risk accordingly without needing to use varying different tool sets, right? And an additional part of CNAPP is also the ability to grow with the organization, right? So as and when new technologies are added into the deployment, CNAPP platforms and CNAPP vendors have to be able to grow with their customers into new technologies. So I'm thinking like infrastructure as a code, or serverless, or function-based, all of the things that are still not mainstream, widely adopted across large-scale industry, but things that are on the verge and will become part of what we consider cloud native deployments, right? So again, the onus on CNAPP as a platform is to grow with the organization, to grow with you, and give you the ability to freely choose where you want to deploy and how you want to deploy without reducing your ability to apply the same security standards, the same compliance standards across your entire infrastructure, right? So really, if nothing else, I think what I would like to kind of bring across is, from a cloud security perspective, CNAPP is the way forward, right? And we've seen this in other industries. Anyone who's familiar with the monitoring industry will remember we've seen a surgence of the term observability. And if you think about it, observability is pretty much what, or CNAPP is pretty much what observability for the monitoring space was as a concept. It starts bringing vendors into the fold of bringing all of their technologies together and creating larger platforms that allow customers to do a holistic view on, in the monitoring space, on the health and the performance of their infrastructure and their assets and their deployments. In the security space, CNAPP does the same thing for security. It gives vendors a framework in which we can work in to really provide customers with a platform that allows customers to deploy wherever they need to, deploy whichever workload they need to, but to be assured that every deployment and every workload can be monitored, can be secured against the same standards, in the same fashion, through the same platform, through the same UI, with the same people, in a much more efficient way. So really, like I said, what I would like to bring across, if nothing else, is CNAPP is going to be the way forward for cloud security. Over the next number of years, we will see more and more vendors become part of the CNAPP conversation and really start bringing different silos of functionality together into one platform. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to open up for questions. Let me have a quick look if I see any. Okay, so we've got two actually. One, whether the recording will be available. Yes, it will be. It usually takes a couple of days, right? So when we've done a session like this, it usually takes a couple of days, and then we'll create the recording and we'll upload it. And sometimes we contribute it through other media as well. But over the next couple of weeks, it will definitely be usable through the website or on the YouTube channel. So thank you. Another question, how is the risk calculated? That's a very interesting one. I generally purposefully didn't go into risk ratings or risk calculations, because it's a minefield of a topic, right? Because there are many different ways to skin a cat, as they say. There's many different ways to calculate risk. There's a lot of different formulas in terms of business logic to arrive at a risk rating, right? In a lot of cases, what still works the best is to just rate by criticality. And that criticality is based on varying factors that come from enriched data, right? So, for example, let's use the CVE as an example, right? We have currently, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 180, 190,000 CVEs that are published. We do have a system like CVSS scores, which is designed to score the vulnerability and give it a risk rating, if you will. But even that can be somewhat misleading because, for example, a vulnerability can be exploitable, but the likelihood is so small because it requires you to be physically in front of the server, right? Is it exploitable? Is it a high risk? Yeah, absolutely. Is it likely to happen? Probably not, right? So the other then is you start enriching that data, right? So for example, you look at things like, is there a known exploit, right? Has this vulnerability been exploited in the wild, right? Whether through a POC or through Metasploit or through an actual exploit, right? And based on that, you can change the criticality of that, right? Because quite frankly, if I have a vulnerability and even if it only has a CVSS score of 6, right? And I'm completely plucking this out of thin air, right? But even if it only has a CVSS score of 6 and there is an active exploit package and it has been used and there has been a breach associated with that, that bumps up the criticality immediately. This is something that I need to get the team to fix yesterday, not during my next patch run or not tomorrow, now, right? So it really comes down to enriching that data and then basing it on criticality, right? To really allow teams to quickly spend time where it's most needed and has the biggest impact. Because I mean, one of the things, and I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Seam Solutions started to become part of offerings, and that was one of the main topics was to cut through the noise, right? Because alert fatigue was one of the terms we used to use in the past, but it really is still the case, right? Even with things like vulnerabilities, where it's very easy in larger scale environments to have hundreds, thousands of workloads that have one or more vulnerabilities that are potentially not even patchable, right? So it comes down to being able to cut through all of that and pick out what's the most critical to do now. And everything else then can, become part of automated routines and things like that. Very good question. I answered live, so I'm not going to type the question. So please, everyone else who's with us, if you have questions, do please put them into the Q&A. Happy to answer. We still have a few minutes left, so I don't want to. I mean, obviously, I'm happy to give you time back, but we still have some time left. So please do ask questions. But it's interesting times, right? I mean, in general, we've come from pure signature-based endpoint protection through to really, like threat intelligence and creating a lot of enrichment data and a lot of ways to define and look at what a threat is and, um, do threat assessments and, do compliance assessments. And we've added a lot of new technologies over the last 10, 15 years. And CNAPP really is just a logical next step to that, right? It's trying to cut through the multitude of different vendors and solutions to allow organizations to have one, right? And it does sound a little bit utopian in the sense that nobody is used to that, but it really is designed to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks, right? I mean, I think the biggest aim for CNAPP as a concept is to ensure that there is one single source of truth, right? One place to correlate and one place to consolidate all of the different data points that come from compliance assessments, vulnerability assessments, patching, remediation, all of these things across all of the different deployments, and to have one singular place where this can be verified and reported on, executed on, and without the need of having to have multiple solutions, and with that, the risk of things just falling through the cracks or not being spotted, right? So I haven't gotten any more questions. I'm going to do a last one, going once, going twice. If anyone still has any questions, you do see an email address here as well. I would urge you go on to, oh, there is one. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, so the question is, will a CNAPP platform give acceleration to dev teams in terms of security? Absolutely, right? So, when you think about dev teams, generally security is somewhat of a necessary evil, right? And I don't mean this in a negative way, but as a developer, what I want to do is I want to create cool products or cool code, right? I don't necessarily want to be dealing with security, right? Yes, secure by design, things like that are really important, but that's more around practices and how we build code rather than the actual security of what gets deployed. But we do still have the problem of supply chain attacks, right? That is still a big problem, and it won't go away anytime soon, right? So for development teams, what CNAPP provides is the integration into the CI/CD pipeline, right? So into the development process. And in a lot of cases, when we think of CI/CD, we think of image-based deployments, right? So Docker, Kubernetes, but Docker images through Kubernetes or similar. And when we think of CNAPP, we can include this into our CI/CD pipeline, make it part of the development process, meaning me as a developer, I have to write my code, package it, do the pull request, get it deployed or get it built, get it put into the build pipeline. And if it relies on images or even code or APIs that are not secure, the system will pick up on it. The system will block the deployment, will report to it, gives me a notice. I can fix whatever needs fixing and redeploy. And I don't have to run around, try to figure out what's causing a problem, or worst case yet, not know that there is a problem, deploy something that will potentially cause the organization to have a breach or similar, right? So yes, it definitely helps with just accelerating the process of getting through potential security hurdles as part of the development process. It's a great question. Thank you very much. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I thank you all very much. I hope it was interesting. I hope it was somewhat beneficial. Yeah, I'll see you all next time whenever we do one again, and you all have a very good day. Thank you very much.